Welcome back to One on One, New York's longest running sports Colin show. We are lucky now to be joined by historian and author Tony Castro. Tony is the author of 8 books, including his newest release, Maris and Mantle, 2 Yankees, Baseball, Immortality, and the Age of Camelot. Tony, welcome to the show, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I want to get right into the new book. It talks about the home run chase between Mantle and Maris in 1961. Was there anything you found particularly special about that season and the relationship between the two players that drove you to write this book?
The relationship between the two players in ways was quite reminiscent of Gehrig and Babe Ruth. And of course, you have to harken back to Babe Ruth's 1927 season when he hit the 60 home runs that Maris and Mantle were trying to break now. And you can almost make the comparison that Gehrig was to Babe what Maris was to Mickey Mantle, in that Babe was considered, the consummate New York Yankee of his time. So was Mickey Mantle. Gehrig had been with the team, since 1925, longer than, say, Maris had been with the Yankees. But it was still that same dynamic between the two competitors. Friends, yeah, they were better friends, Mantle and Maris, than they've been credited for being, and that played a great deal into what was going on in '61. I think Maris had the advantage of knowing that Mickey was right behind him and in the batting order, as well as in the support that he had from Mantle that entire season. And Mantle, on the other hand, Mantle was the old guy at the age of 29. He was the guy who was expected to break Babe Ruth's record. There was tremendous pressure on him, although he claimed there wasn't. And as the season progressed, that pressure increased as Roger Maris didn't fall off. He continued hitting home runs. He continued going past the number he had ever hit. And he was a competitor unlike anything else that Mickey Mantle had ever had in his career.
Such a fascinating topic, the relationship between Maris and Mantle, such an interesting period of time in baseball history. Tony, it's great to have you on the show. I'm wondering, what goes into making a book of this magnitude?
Well, luck, for one. I grew up with Mickey Mantle as a hero. In 1961, I was as heartbroken as so many Yankee fans and Mickey Mantle fans that it wasn't he who broke the record. I wouldn't say that I never forgave Roger Maris, but I never took the opportunity of interviewing him when I had chances to interview him during the years after 1961. I was a political reporter. That's how I made my name, I guess, if you want to call it that. When I left college in 1970, my first newspaper job, I quickly became a political reporter in Texas. And I had opportunities to like a Nieman Fellowship at Harvard in 1976 and 1977. And it was there on a real cold winter day that they had a symposium on JFK and Camelot, the Camelot years. I attend that. We're freezing my tail off along with everybody else there in that auditorium. And Arthur Schlesinger Jr., the great historian of politics and presidents, was on stage. And I don't know, I thought maybe it was just a cold. He wound up saying something like, something to the effect that the age of Camelot, the early 60s, were defined as much by Maris and Mantle and their chase of this home run record and their what they did in those early 60s with the New York Yankees, as it was by JFK and his presidency. And of course, this was like, people looked up, and maybe that's what Schlesinger wanted them to do. But as he talked more, and you got to know Schlesinger more, I got to know him after naturally you want to talk to him after the symposium. He was a great baseball man, great baseball fan. His father, Arthur Schlesinger Sr., had been a big baseball fan of the Boston Red Sox there in Boston. And so young Arthur, the only way he could really connect with his dad at that time, Arthur being substantially younger than his father, was through baseball. So they became big Red Sox fans. They became big baseball fans. And Schlesinger knew a great deal about baseball. He could talk about baseball. He could talk about this 61 season. And when we cornered him afterwards and asked him to if he could really back that up, that statement, and we all thought it was just in jest. He says, yeah, he thought he could. He said by the end of 1963, JFK was dead, unfortunately. Mantle and Maris were still, together. And this was after 1960 and a great year that they both had, although they didn't win the World Series. 61 when they made history together. 62, 63, they won another World Series in 62 and 63. Were beaten only by Sandy Koufax and his, tremendous pitching exhibition in the World Series. 64, they're in the World Series again. So he's saying, look, in that early 60s, those two guys and the effect that they had on Americans who were tuning in every night, more to find out how did they hit. Did Mantle hit a home run? Did Maris hit a home run? They were tuning in, unlike, say, tuning in to find out, well, how's JFK today? Did he get over this crippling situation in Cuba with the Bay of Pigs in 1961, which hurt the Kennedy legacy quite a bit? Or in 62, when he almost took us to a nuclear war with the Russians over the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then into 63 and the scandals that were there underneath the surface. Kennedy with, being involved with a woman who was the girlfriend of a mobster. Kennedy carrying on with Marilyn Monroe. Schlesinger was no slouch when it came to putting history into context, and he was aware of all the negatives with the Kennedy administration, even though he was known as a Kennedy homer. That's probably more than you need to know from me on this particular question, but I get carried away talking about Schlesinger and a guy like that being such a baseball fan as he was.
Tony, you have written a lot of stories about Yankee legends and about the relationship between these players, such as in your books, Garrick and the Babe, DiMaggio and Mick, and now Maris and Mantle. Is there anything in particular special about the relationships between Yankee greats that you find so interesting and make you want to write about them?
Well, in this one, I hadn't thought of comparing Maris and Mantle with Ruth and Garrick. To me, there was no comparison. The eras, it's difficult to compare those eras. But the more I studied both men, especially Maris, as I got to know him better, and like I said, I never interviewed him, but I have a friend, Peter Golenbach, the great writer from Florida, who has written about baseball more than I have. When I told Peter, hey, I'm working on this book, but I feel weird about it because I never had a chance to interview him. Peter says, look, I've got a long interview with Roger that I took, that I taped in 1973. I've never used it. It's never been used. You're more than welcome to it. I mean, how much more gracious and magnanimous can you get than somebody who does that something for you? He sends me this. No, I was expecting, okay, I'm gonna have to now tape, type the script up. It was already typewritten. And I'm like, my Lord, taught me a great deal about humanity, taught me a great deal about friendship, taught me a great deal about people. And authors are sometimes in competition with one another. Peter's one of these guys who, he says, we're all in this together, and he certainly made a believer out of me. But in this, with Maris and finding that that interview so helpful, I came to see Maris. Maris was to Mantle as Garrick was to Ruth, and maybe that's overly simplistic, but the other part about this is that both Maris and Garrick were these guys who you would want your children to follow after. I often tell people that, look, Mickey Mantle, like Babe Ruth, was someone that I admired, and they were their role model for me, and maybe that's what I wanted to be, a guy who was at times a broken down buffoon like Ruth was, or just a broken down drunk like Mantle was at times. But as far as the other two guys, Garrick and Maris, this is what I would want my sons to be like. This is who your role model should be. And I have two sons. They're both in their early 30s, and I'm like, wow, these are the guys that you should pattern. If you're going to pattern yourself after any baseball player, these are the guys.
Tony, I'm wondering, with the prestige of the 1920s Yankees, the chaos that ensues in the late 70s in the Bronx, and that new age dynasty that took control in the 90s, Do you think that the Maris and Mantle teams are often underappreciated as a part of Yankees history and baseball lore?
I think many of these teams are. You know, the Reggie Jackson teams, even though it was only a 2-year run in the 70s, often is, you know, shoved aside. And they were an incredible team. Maybe I feel that way because I was living back east at that time, and I happened to see them quite often. And was at the World Series where, you know, Reggie hit 3 home runs on three swings, and then saw them again the following year. I think we tend to forget about our history and maybe just accept it for what it is. These guys, whether it's in the books that we read and find out about Ruth and Gehrig and all their heroics, I think we take them for granted. The same way with DiMaggio and Berra. DiMaggio and Gehrig in the mid 30s. DiMaggio in the 40s before the war, and DiMaggio after the war. That 1951 season that the Yankees won with Mickey Mantle. That was DiMaggio's farewell season, and yet that was a season where he came through so well. And in DiMaggio and Mick, one of the things that I go into is how, contrary to popular belief, for whatever reason it's been there, these two guys were closer. I wouldn't say best friends, but they weren't the enemies, the bitter enemies and the rivals that people made them out to be, DiMaggio and Mantle. And so you get into the 90s. Wow, you're getting into an era that I think down the way is going to be looked upon as just magnificent. Jeter, God, I mean, maybe not in numbers, but certainly in reputation and in that Gehrig Mantle character. How can you argue? I mean, if you were having to put a threesome of characters, a character among Yankees, it would be Gehrig, Maris, and Jeter.
Tony, we live in an age where analytics drive the game of baseball now. Launch angle are really the ways people are hitting homers nowadays. Is it even fair to compare, the 50 homer hitting sluggers from the 50s and 60s to the analytic driven slugger from today?
It's not, but we're going to, obviously. I mean, the thing you can say about it is that Roger Maris and the swing that he had and that he wouldn't change during the years he was in the minors. In the minors, playing in the minors for the Indians, they tried to change that swing of his, which was an uppercut. In fact, it's the kind of swing you see from home run hitters today. Roger stuck with that swing, and that was the swing that made him who he was. And that's the swing that we see so often today. That slight uppercut, hitting, putting the right kind of spin if you're going to be pulling the ball, say. I don't know who you can give credit to on that for Roger, because he rejected lessons from anybody. And it's something that he obviously just picked up as a teenager. His dad, to some degree, his older brother, probably to a greater degree.
In talking about the home run swing and home run chases, like the one that took place in that summer of '61 between Maris and Mantle, do you see the race between McGwire and Sosa in '98 in the same light as the one that took place between the two Yankee legends, or is it a different thing altogether, given everything we now know?
I think it was even different then. They weren't teammates. They played in the same league and sometimes played against each other. They were, it was a different time. You had not only newspaper people and television people after you, you had, that was the beginning of the blogger period already. I mean, I know a friend of mine down in Houston claims he was the first blogger in America, and he was already in business at that time. So you had a different kind of media. You had this 24-hour, we talk about a 24-hour news cycle. We have a 24-hour sports news cycle. And that was in its early stages there in 1998. I think the other thing about we forget about with McGwire and Sosa is that baseball loves this kind of stuff. And with baseball, I mean, in 1994, 95, 96, baseball was in the throes of doldrum. and also, fans weren't coming to the games that they had been, and they needed some kind of spark to save baseball, as it were. And what better thing can you have than a home run chase like this, like they had in '98? And after that, the numbers went up as along. I'm talking about the numbers of fans, watchers, viewers on television, and of course, home runs. Much like you're seeing today, you're not seeing it as a singular kind of a thing. You do have some people that have hit, into the 40s and probably, may finish up in the 50s before the season ends here in the next few days. But it's not like any one individual going after the record. What you do have is home runs being hit almost at a rate that we've never seen before. Something's going on. It's not the players that we know of. I mean, they test them often enough. Maybe they ought to start testing the baseballs.
You talked about the relationship between Maris and Mantle, and also between Garrick and Babe. What have you seen any relationships in the modern baseball that maybe look very similar to those relationships, maybe between teammates and players on opposing teams? Are there any relationships in the MLB today that remind you of the relationships of those players?
Ohtani and I've drawn a senior moment here. The great outfielder for the Angels,
Mike Trout. I think.
Yes, I mean those two guys. I mean, how can those two guys, as great of ball players as they are, and are developing to be on such a mediocre team? I mean, that would be like having Maris and Mantle play for the old Washington Senators, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I see it there. I mean, I think some of it might have been developing in San Diego, but I think the team fell into the ocean after Memorial Day, and we've never seen them playing well again. But Tatis is a great slugger, and you're going to have partner up with somebody, even if it's not one of his current teammates. And I don't know about other teams. I mean, it's so hard to say. I focused so much on this book, and I was so curious about Ohtani that I thought, well, is there something there? Not from a writing standpoint, but just as a fan standpoint, and spent too much time at Angels Ballpark.
In researching about the 61 chase and for the book, was there anything that surprised you that you would not have assumed going into the project?
I had already done a great deal of research on that at one point. The first book that I did on Mantle came out in 2002. It was called Mickey Mantle, America's Prodigal Son. And I'd never written a baseball book before. I had written a book on civil rights years ago, back when I was a young man in the 70s. And my agent said, shortly after Mantle died, why don't you take a shot at doing this book that you say has never been done on Mantle? You knew him. You have some personal stuff. He may be dead in the next couple of months. It turned out he was dead in a couple of weeks. Think about it. And I did. And I had about 4 years later, I turned in a manuscript of about between 2,500 and 3,000 pages, which correlates to like about 800,000 words. This particular book is around 100,000. So that book, the manuscript that I originally turned in was just far too long to publish, and we had to cut more than half of the book. And in cutting it, some of the things that I cut, the relationship between Mantle and Stengel, Mantle and DiMaggio, and you see where that wound up. Mantle and Berra, Mantle and Billy Martin. I could go on, Mantle and Maris for sure. We pulled that out because the Billy Crystal movie had just the HBO movie 61 had just come on in 2001, and it had stolen the show, the thunder from anything that was Yankees and home run related. And they thought, well, trim down that particular relationship. And so we cut a great deal of the Mantle Maris research that had been done at that time. What I added to it in doing this book was Peter's interviews, some sabermetrics that wasn't around in 2002, or if it was in the rudimentary stage. And getting more background on Maris and Maris's early years, his early years as a Eastern European immigrant son, which makes up a great deal of the beginning of the book.
Tony, I do want to bring it back to maybe these modern day Yankees. They've been kind of donned the baby bomber era with Aaron Judge, Gary Sanchez, players of the team like that. Do you ever find yourself comparing Yankee eras, maybe this modern Yankee team, to teams of past, like the 1961 Yankees, maybe even further back, like the 1927 Yankees?
Well, a few years ago, I thought there was that similarity with Judge and Sanchez, and it just didn't seem to work out as well as as I thought it could have been. I think the competition is a lot tougher today. The pitching is tougher today than it was at that time. I mean, you're looking at 3, 4, 5 different pitchers in a game, depending on how that game is going, as opposed to one pitcher that you can kind of hone in on and study. And even though back in that particular day they may not have had the digital media that allows us to go back in and what did he throw me that last time? What did he get me out with? Players, these players are pretty smart. So I think it's a lot tougher today to lock into that thing like what we had with Maris and Mantle and Gehrig and the Babe. And so my hat's off to the modern day ball player. He's struggling with, not only playing, at night, playing under these circumstances with everyone looking at you, with the money that's attached to you, the resentments that are there from parts of society that don't think ball players should be paid this much, and then having to compete, having to look at these 3 or 4 different pitchers at each game. Judge is an incredible specimen. So is Sanchez, and yeah, I think they could, given the right set of circumstances, it could work out for them. But wow, I mean, I just marvel at looking at modern day baseball. Maybe it's because I'm old and I look at this and a 98-mile-an-hour pitch or a 95-mile-an-hour pitch looks like 105, and I can't really see it. It's like, well, somebody enlarged my TV. Thank God they've got huge TVs now so that old people can look at them and can pick up the ball. Because otherwise it's like looking at a hockey game. Where is that ball?
Tony Castro, author of Maris and Mantle. Be sure to check that book out. It's out everywhere now. Tony, thanks for giving us your time and coming on the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very kind.